Buenas tardes y buenas noches, en este caso, a todos, según donde se encuentren.
Good morning
Mi nombre es
and good
Joshua Paternino
afternoon.
Blanco y
My
soy
name is
oficial de
Joshua,
investigación del Foro Internacional de
and I
Transportes
am
dentro
part
de
of
la
the
OCDE.
International
Me
Transport Forum within
complace
the
en este momento, a las 3 de la
OCD.
tarde parisinas, a las
I
10 de la
am
mañana,
happy
tiempo
now
Buenos
to
Aires,
welcome
darles la
you
bienvenida a esta nuestra
to
octava
this
sesión
eighth
en esta serie de
session
conferencias
of this
virtuales
series
sobre
of virtual
descarbonización de transportes
conferences with
en una
regards
crisis
to
global sin precedentes. Antes
decarbonizing
de cederle
transport
la
in an
palabra a
unprecedented
Carolina
global
Chantil, quien será
crisis.
la
Before
moderadora en este evento, me permitiré
um,
darles
giving the floor
brevemente
to the
algunas
moderator, I'm
informaciones
going to give you some
técnicas y de
information,
contexto
technical
sobre
and
esta serie de
contextual
conferencias
information with
virtuales que
regards
estamos
to this
organizando.
series of virtual conferences that we're carrying out.
Antes que nada, me gustaría llamar su
First of
atención al
all,
hecho de que
I'd
hay
like
interpretación
to tell
disponible
you
en dos
that we do
idiomas,
have
inglés y español.
interpretation in English
Para poder acceder a
and
ella,
Spanish. In
simplemente
order to
denle clic al
access it,
botón del
just
globo o
click
planeta que se encuentra en
on
la
the
parte
world
inferior de su
icon that
pantalla
is at the
dentro de
bottom of
Zoom.
your screen.
Escoja
Within
su idioma de preferencia y
that,
escuche
choose the
tranquilamente.
language you prefer.
Les recomendamos que no
We
apaguen el sonido
recommend
original.
that you don't
No
turn off
presione
the
el
original
Mute
sound. Do
Original
not
Audio y simplemente
do
déjenlo
the
en el
mute
idioma de
original
preferencia y
audio and just
escuche a
leave
la
your
conferencia.
preferred language so you can hear the conference.
Igualmente es importante mencionar que esta sesión
It
está
is
siendo grabada en vivo.
important to
Las
tell you that
grabaciones de
we
esta
are being
sesión, así como
recorded,
las
the
presentaciones de
recording and the
los panelistas
presentations
y
of all the
aquellas de las
panelists
sesiones previas que hemos organizado, podrán
from
ser
all the
encontradas
sessions that
en
we've
el
carried out
enlace que ven a
will
continuación.
be seen in the
También
link
les
shown
invitamos a
below. We
compartir e
also
interactuar en
invite
redes
you to
sociales, en Twitter y
participate in
LinkedIn,
our
al
social
respecto de
media
lo que
in
suceda en
LinkedIn
esta
and
sesión con los
Twitter
hashtags
with regards
Decarbonizing
to
Transport
this
Argentina
with the
y
hashtag
Descarbonización
Decarbonizing Transport
Transporte Argentina.
Argentina y
Pueden hacer
Descarbonización
esto sobre
Transporte
todo
Argentina.
en
You
el
can do
link
this
del grupo
particularly
LinkedIn
in
que
the
hemos
LinkedIn
dispuesto a
group
este fin.
for Decarbonizing Argentina that we have organized and set
Para
up.
aquellos que no tienen
For
tanto
those
hábito de utilizar Zoom,
who are not
podrán
so used
encontrar
to using
información
social
en el
media, you
espacio
may
de
be
chat.
able to
Ahí
find
mis colegas estarán
information in the
compartiendo con
chat
ustedes
box.
información
The
pertinente sobre
colleagues
este evento
will
y
be
sobre
sharing
iniciativas afines. Así
relevant
que
information with
estén
regards to this event
pendientes de
and
la
other
opción del
relevant
chat.
information.
Igualmente tendrán la opción de hacer
You
preguntas y
will also
respuestas
have
con el
the
botón Q
choice
y A.
to
Al final de la
answer
sesión
on the
habrá
Q&A.
espacio para que
We will have
puedan
a
ser hechas
time
estas
for a
preguntas
Q&A
a los
session at the
panelistas
end,
y que se respondan algunas de
and the
ellas.
panelists might be
Algún
able to answer
consejo
some
es
of
que
them.
puedan hacer estas
The other
preguntas
bit
lo
of
más
advice is
pronto
that
posible
please
para que se pueda
do your
aprovechar el
questioning
tiempo
as
de
soon as
preguntas y
possible so
respuestas
we
al
can
final
make the
de la
most
mejor
of the
manera.
Q&A session at the end of
Ya que
today's
hemos
presentations.
contextualizado estos detalles técnicos,
We
permítame
already
brevemente
have this.
explicarles el por qué estamos aquí.
I want to
Este
explain why we're
evento
here.
hace
This
parte
event
de
is
un
part
proyecto
of
mayor
a
sobre
project
descarbonización de transportes
with
en
regards to
economías
decarbonizing
emergentes o
transport
DTE.
in
El
emerging
proyecto
economies.
DTE
The
está
TEE
siendo llevado a cabo
project
entre el
is
Foro
being
Internacional de
carried out
Transportes
between
y el
the
Instituto Wuppertal
ITF and the
y
Wuppertal
está siendo
Institute,
financiado por la
and it
Iniciativa
is
Internacional del
being
Clima
funded
del Ministerio
by
Federal
the
para el Medio
Federal
Ambiente, la
Ministry for
Protección de
the
la
Environment,
Naturaleza y la
Nature
Seguridad
Conservation
Nuclear
and
de
Nuclear
Alemania.
Safety of Germany.
El proyecto busca
The
principalmente
project
apoyar a autoridades de
seeks
4
to
países,
support the
Argentina,
authorities of four
Azerbaiyán,
countries,
India y
Argentina,
Marruecos,
Azerbaijan, India, and
a poder
Morocco,
descarbonizar
to be
los
able to
sectores de transporte de sus
decarbonize
países
transport
respectivos.
sectors in their
Igualmente busca promover el
respective
diálogo
countries, and it wants to
y el
promote
intercambio de
dialogue
políticas
and
públicas en
the
materia de
exchange of public
descarbonización de
policies when
transportes
it comes to
en las
decarbonizing
áreas globales en
transport
las que se encuentran estos
in the
países.
global areas
Esta
that
serie de
these
conferencias
countries
virtuales
are
está
set
siendo
in.
organizada
These
en el
virtual
marco
conferences
del
have been organized
componente
within
argentino
the
y
Argentine
latinoamericano
component and
de
Latin
este
American
proyecto.
component of this
Para la serie de
project.
conferencias virtuales,
For the series
el Foro
of
Internacional de
virtual
Transportes y el Instituto
conferences,
Wuppertal cuentan
the
y agradecen
Wuppertal Institute and the
especialmente la
ITF
colaboración
particularly thank
de
the collaboration
organizaciones como
of
el Ministerio de
organizations
Transportes
such
de
as the
Argentina,
Ministry of
la Asociación
Transport of
Sustentar
Argentina,
y el
Asociación
Grupo
Sustentar,
Regional
and
para
the
América
regional
Latina y el
group
Caribe
for Latin America and
del
the
Let's
Caribbean
Global
of the
Partnership,
Let's
del que hace
Global Partnership,
parte Sustentar al mismo tiempo.
where Sustentar is a
Como
part of.
muchos de ustedes han
As many
podido
of you
presenciar a
have
lo largo
been
de las
able
últimas
to
semanas, la serie de
see in the
conferencias
last few
empezó el
weeks, the
7 de
series of
julio.
conferences began
En
on the
total se
7th
han
July.
desarrollado
We
unos
have carried
7,
out
ahora
about
8 seminarios
7 and
abiertos
now
y
8 open
contaremos con uno
seminars,
último
and there is one
a finales de
left
esta semana.
which will be at the
A
end
lo
of
largo de
this
la serie de
week.
conferencias, el objetivo ha sido el poder
Through these
entender
series of
cómo se pueden
conferences, we've tried
descarbonizar el
to
sector de
find
transportes
out
en
how we can
economías emergentes,
decarbonize
al mismo tiempo que se
the
responden
transport
con
in
las prioridades de
emerging
política pública traídas por el
economies with public
COVID-19.
policies
Algunas de estas
that are
prioridades,
by
como
now
muchos lo pueden
affected by
saber, son el
COVID-19.
poder
As
relanzar la
many of you
economía,
know,
el
we
desarrollar
need to
sistemas de transportes
relaunch economy
resilientes,
and
así
develop
como poder
resilient
asegurar
transport
servicios de
systems and to be
transportes
able to
esenciales al mismo
ensure
tiempo que
essential
se
transport
garantizan los criterios
services at the same
sanitarios
time
de
that you
base ligados
guarantee
a la crisis.
sanitary
A lo
requirements
largo
that the crisis
de
has
las sesiones
imposed.
hemos tratado
Through
sobre
these
todo transporte
sessions,
de cargas, pero también hemos
we've
tenido
talked about
unas
freight,
sesiones un
but we've
poco
also had some
más amplias.
sessions
En el
that
caso
are
de
a bit
hoy,
wider.
como podrán ver,
Today, as you can
el
see,
tema es
the
descarbonización de
subject is
transporte, al mismo
transport
tiempo que se
decarbonization
hace o se promueve en el marco de la
at the
crisis
same
el
time that within
desarrollo
these
regional
crises we
territorial.
promote regional territorial
Habiéndoles
development.
dado estos elementos de
Having
contexto,
given
me
you
permito
this
finalmente presentar a
context,
la
I
moderadora
am
de la
now
sesión de
going
hoy.
to introduce the
Carolina
moderator
Chantrill
for
es
today,
líder del
Carolina
área de movilidad
Chantrill,
sostenible de la Asociación
responsible
Sustentar
for
y
the
coordinadora
sustainable
del grupo de trabajo
mobility
de
of
transporte de la
Sustentar.
plataforma
She
regional Let's Slack,
coordinates
de nuevo, de la
the
que
Let's
Sustentar hace
Slack
parte. Tiene una larga
platform.
experiencia
She has
trabajando en
gained
temas de
experience
desarrollo
over
urbano
more than
sostenible
10
y
years with
procesos de
regards to
integración
sustainable
sociourbana y
transport
desarrollo
and
de
also
infraestructura de
social
servicios básicos.
urban
También ha trabajado en
structure.
temas afines de
She's also
desarrollo de
worked in
operaciones de
other
financiamiento multilateral.
operations to do with
Ella es ingeniera
multilateral
ambiental,
funding.
graduada de la
She is
Universidad Católica Argentina
an
y posee
environmental
una maestría
engineer
de
from the
planificación
Universidad
urbana de la
Católica
Universidad de
Argentina and
Illinois
has
en
an MSc from
Urbana-Champaign
the
en
urban
Estados Unidos.
planning of the
Sin más que
University
decir,
of
les dejo con mi
Illinois at
colega
Urbana in
Carolina
the
Chantrell.
US. I give you the floor. Thank you so much, Joshua, for your introduction and for introducing today's panel. As Joshua was saying, from Asociación Sustentar, we coordinate the group for Latin America and the Caribbean of the Global Partnership Place. We've been doing this since 2014, and due to our work in the region, we are participating in this project with the ITF and the Wuppertal Institute. Like the panelists and other speakers in other sessions, as Joshua was saying, I want to welcome everybody who is here today, all the listeners and also the panelists who I will introduce shortly. The panel that I have to moderate today has to do between the relationship between transport decarbonization with territorial development in the region. As was mentioned in this conference before, we know that the transport area is responsible for almost a quarter of the carbon emissions with regards to the production of energy. And according to a recent report in the last few years, we know that the emissions of freight are going up by 75% between 20 and 2015, and we expect that to continue. Within the COVID crisis, as Joshua said, we saw that this was an important issue, transport. One, with regards to the propagation of the disease, and also anything to do with provisioning basic goods, medical goods, and foods, and also the mobility for essential workers at the beginning of the pandemic, and also with regards to the recovery in the different phases of the health crisis that we're undergoing. But we're also using a lot more of e-commerce in this crisis, and that also means that we need to consider certain things when it comes to the future. On the other hand, as we all know, transport is an activity that comes from the need to move ourselves and goods, and therefore sometimes it is like a derived demand of the socioeconomic activity. It is important to consider what are the developmental patterns that we use in this region. And that's why we propose for this panel to try and answer the following questions. Like everybody who works in the transport sector, we know that we should take into account the territorial dimension. How can we have a joint agenda for decarbonization and territorial development as a means to boost economies and create resiliency at regional level? And I add, what strategies at territorial level can we use to get to these objectives, and what systems of transport are better for the territorial development plan that we have for Argentina or the region? These are just some of the questions that we can bring up. We don't expect you to do all of them, but we can exchange ideas and know how to be able to enrich the public policies and to make them more dynamic. The panel today is by leading figures, professionals. Lou Taek-soon, advisor of the Singapore Land Transport Authority Academy. Agustina González Heath, the Secretary of Planning of the City of Rosario in Argentina. Christopher Zegras is the Professor of Mobility and Urban Planning and Department Head of the MIT. Marelia Martinez Rivas is a consultant and expert on freight logistics and trade facilitation. And lastly, Seung-Kook Woo, who is a senior researcher of the Korean Transport Institute, COTI. In the name of the organizers, we welcome and thank you all for being here. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce Lou Taek-soon, our first panelist. He is an advisor of the LTA Academy, LTAA, and the Singapore Rail Academy, SGRA, in the Land Transport Authority, LTA, in Singapore. He advises on and develops capability building programs, and he has collaborated with the UITP, the World Bank, and the Asian Development Bank and universities on various programs and studies. Previously, he was helmed many divisions in the LTA, including policy, research, and technology divisions. He led the Public Transport Council to implement fares, ticketing, and bus reforms. He's a civil engineer and has experience in transport policy, regulatory and licensing matters, transport planning, integrated land use studies, rail design, expressways, road design, operations, and maintenance. He has a lot of know-how with what you're doing. So, Lou Taek-soon, you have the floor.
Thank you, Carolina. Let me pull up my slide. Okay. Good morning, afternoon, evening from all over the world. I'm Taek-soon. You can call me TS from Singapore. Today, my presentation will touch mainly on the integrated land use and transport planning. I will give you some examples, very specific strategies that we have taken just to share with you what we have done. A little bit of introduction. Singapore is very small, as you can see from the map. It's 725 square kilometers. Population 5.7, not very big, but very dense. In terms of our infrastructure, you can see that on the top right-hand corner. Expressway 160. Expressways are basically your freeways, roads, total 3,500 kilometers, cars 624,000, but total vehicles close to 1 million. The important point that I want to mention here is that every day we have 10 million passenger trips, comprising mainly the rail, bus, taxis, including the active mobility. This refers to walking, cycling, and some of the people mover systems. We do have our master plan, just like any other planning agency. In the days when LTA was formed, right in year 1996, thereabout, we have our first master plan, so to speak. At that point, we have a white paper. Since then, every 5 years, we refresh and renew our plan. So right now, we are into 2020, and we are now in the implementation of the plan that what we call Land Transport Master Plan 2040. Okay. Basically, it has 3 components. I will not go very much into detail. You can easily check out our website. The first part of it is very much like infrastructure development. We call it 20-minute towns. That means within each town, you should be able to access anywhere within the towns in the time of 20 minutes. And 45-minute city, in other words, if you cross the whole island, going from one point to another, it should not take more than 45 minutes. We do have a second chunk of it, which is called Transport for All. It is more inclusive. We look at caring, commuting, as well as for the people with disability. We call it the barrier-free journeys. The third part of the Land Transport Master Plan 2040 has to do with healthy lives and safer journey. And in this, we talk about cleaner buses, etc., etc. So a lot of details. We have moved from very supply-driven in the early years, basically like any other infrastructure plan, to now what we call a very aspirational outcome master plan. In terms of planning, as in with this topic, we do integrate land use and transport from the start. It has been our consistent strategy applied since independence in 1965, a little over 50 years. You can see here on the left-hand side, a series of plans, concept plan, all the way to currently to the future plan beyond 2030. And coupled with that is our transportation plan. How do we do it? On your right-hand side, basically a very quick view of the process we've gone through. From the concept plan, we derive master plan, and we have our usual planning feasibility studies. All these correspond to different time horizon that we look at. And from the planning feasibility study, we generate two chunks of a plan. One broadly is the 5-year road development program that has to do with roads, building, construction, expressway, etc. The other part of it has to do with rail lines, mass rapid transit lines, as well as the bus network. So these two go hands in hand. I want to talk about judicious land development. Singapore, as I have said, you can see earlier, is a small city-state, very compact, high density. Therefore, land is scarce, it's very precious to us, and we have to make full use of the land that's available. In this slide that I would like to show, how then do we go about developing land, or using the land for development purposes? We have the usual land assembly from the left-hand side. This one, we have our mandate to acquire land. We resettle some of the older settlements. We compensate them for the resettlement. We also alienate and reparcel the land as far as we can get. So that's on the assembly part. We get the land, and then we have to release the land for development. And in this way, we have a few key things we have here. We use one is we call it the government land sale. We actually tender out the land parcels for development. We determine the quantum, we look at the site selection, and when do we release the land for market use. Sometimes we do direct allocation for specific reasons, like business park or airport, or etc. And we control very tightly on development. So there will be submissions, application, building plans, all those are subject to regulatory approvals. So if you look carefully on the right-hand side, I would like to summarize in 3 areas and undertaken by 3 very different government agencies. One is what we call the land use objectives. This one, we have the chief planner, our urban renewal redevelopment authority takes care of it. And for me, my agency is land transport objectives. Obviously, for us, we have a purpose of putting in transport facilities. So we have objectives to meet. That is the second bubble. And the third one, I call it the land use objectives. This one has to do with the state land, the land that belongs to the government. And this one, the Singapore Land Authority is in charge. And the 3 government agencies work together to deliver the kind of land development and use for national, the outcomes that we want to achieve. I mentioned here how then we rope in the private sector, because government is not just development land for public use. We rely heavily on private sector to put the land, to tender for the land into good use. I will now go on to some very specific examples. The first one I want to talk about is the Integrated Lifestyle Hub. As you can see in this map on the left, a lot of bubbles. These are the land area for housing as well as commercial use. they are scattered. There are constellation plans that we talk about that you along the major railway lines that you see in yellow, faintly in yellow here. And these are sited in specific nodes where we develop integrated lifestyle hubs, combining both housing, as you can see in the picture, as well as commercial development, light rail, as well as heavy rail in the bottom. So this is the strategy that we adopt. Strategically develop lifestyle hubs according to a long-range plan, which I just described earlier, that's mapped out in our master plan. A second example that I want to mention is we pay attention to urban logistics. And in this, we look at the entire ecosystem. If you look at my left, there's a map of Singapore. We look at where we locate our port, our distribution center, as well as our airport on the east. This is the Changi region, and the west is the Tuas harbor, the port. So logistics are being distributed. And we look at various sectors, and these are very important: retail, food, retail, as well as construction, including the haulage of waste, sludge, etc. And we look at development areas. How then do we link the entire system for the transport and movement of goods? This one has to do with the goods, logistics. And in recent time, very recently, we started this concept of federated lockers. To this, we means we strategically locate some of these lockers, federated lockers, at certain transport nodes for people to distribute and deposit the goods to be collected by individual households. This is a second example. A third one I would like to mention is our private transport, which contributes a lot to our green environment. And this one, in this chart here, this diagram here, I show both the push and pull factor, mainly the push factor for private transport. I divide into ownership measure, as you can see on the horizontal below. Ownership has to do with how you own the car, etc. Usage has to deal with use. And on the vertical side, you can look at monetary instruments, the policy they introduce, as well as non-monetary. We control our ownership through the vehicle quota system. We call it, we have to look at you have to actually tender for a certificate of entitlement in order to own vehicles. And in this way, we control the vehicle growth rates. I've given here on top, zero vehicle growth rate. I mentioned earlier about 900,000, close to 1 million vehicles. That is controlled. So every year by year now is reduced to zero. The vehicle will not exceed this cap, this amount of cars on a road. On the right-hand side, you can see electronic road pricing, which I will explain in a short while, and some other parking and measures that we put in place. I won't go into details, and this one you can easily check out through more details in our website, or I can answer some questions you have some, if any. The fourth one, I have to touch on congestion charging. Singapore probably will be the first, was the first one to introduce area licensing scheme way back in 1975. And we have since moved on to electronic road charging, and we have gantry system. As you can see, we call it ERP, electronic road pricing. We divide, especially the city area. This is the center on the left, city center. We have certain cordons, certain ring road, and the red arrows coming in are the expressways, the high speed, high capacity expressway leading to the city center. And these are all the points where we price the road, where you have to, where you will be charged if you enter a specific time of the day. How do we charge? We look at the top right-hand corner, some arrows there. We actually determine the speed on the road, average speed on the road. For expressway, if the speed, general traffic conditions, the road are free-flowing, if the speed can exceed 65 kilometers, for example, the charge that you pay in order to enter the city center or to pass through the gantry will be reduced. Conversely, if the speed is low, that means it has a lot of congestion, and therefore the price will increase accordingly. So there is a range of speed, we call it the optimal range, which is in the blue color here. Correspondingly, for other roads, different speeds are calibrated. So we do harness technology and data to shape the transport demand on our roads. The last one, which is the fifth example, this is a bit more recent. We have been doing a lot of green movements, and they are actually calibrated interventions, the government policy intervention, as well as nudges, the way we encourage people to go car light. Car light means less car, not no car, but less car. So if you look at the circle in the center of the slide, we use the term walk, cycle, and ride. So we encourage people to anchor the transport mode on ride, R-I-D-E, which comprise all our mass public transport like buses and trains. Walk, for walking, we look at walking, cycle, as well as other e-scooters. On the right side, for the blue, we have taxis, private car, hired car, as well as car sharing. So all these schemes together form the kind of movement, the interventions that we have collectively as a package, so that people will be consistent in terms of messaging and strategy to go car light. All right, so that's it. I mentioned a few in just the summary. We start with very clear vision, the kind of long-term planning. We talk about 40, 50 years concept plan down to 15, 20 years kind of feasibility study, and then the plans accordingly. I've also shared 5 areas where we try to get the kind of outcomes. In this case, the less environmental friendly, less congestion, decarbonization, in the light of decarbonization. 5 specific areas. We do integrated of land use. We do system-wide planning. That's I use the idea of the urban logistics. A series of push and pull measures. Look at congestion charging, as well as vehicle ownership. The last one is behavioral nudges, which is the one that I've just mentioned, the movements of the green movements that we have. In short, if you have to take away from what we have done very quickly in this presentation, it's really about getting the basics right. So we think carefully what we want to do, and as long as you get the basics right, then it should not be an issue in terms of implementation. On the right-hand side is if you want to read more about how we go about doing in a Singapore way, this is quite a good framework. It sets off clearly how then do we get the outcome, which is a competitive economy, a sustainable environment, as well as a quality of life that we want in Singapore. And below the triangle are the few areas on how we went about doing it. You can read more about it. And what we have shared actually falls very much the way we do in order to deliver the outcome we have. And I think that's all I can share with you. I'm open to questions. This is the last slide of thank you. It shows 2 pictures, day and night. This is something that we aspire, we look forward to in the years to come, where the whole environment is created in the most environmentally friendly and sustainable manner, anchored by public transport at the bottom, as well as a lot of amenities and a nice environment created for housing, etc. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Lutixun, por tu presentación. La verdad
Thank you so much for your presentation. I think it's been a very clear presentation. I think about the experience in Korea, highlights planning, and planning in particular, between the different objectives with regards to territorial development, transport, objectives, and the value that you can get of using the land. Singapore has very specific needs with regards to the availability of land and their density when it comes to activities and transport. So I think it's a great example for us to look at and to see how we can use such a scarce resource. We're going to go to the next panelist. And before that, I'd like to make the most to remind people that in this virtual seminar, you can leave your questions and comments for all of the panelists. We are using that as a guide to ask questions at the end. And please remember to name the panelists that you wish to respond to your questions. Now, our next panelist is Agustina González Cid. She is a Secretary of Planning of the City of Rosario. She is an architect and urban designer. She has a Master of Science in Architecture and Urban Studies from the MIT, which she completed as a Fulbright Scholar.
Wow.
And she also has a postgraduate degree in Architecture and Technology from the School of Architecture and Urban Studies of the Torquato Di Tella University. She has a professional degree in architecture from the National University of Rosario. She's currently the planning secretary of the city of Rosario and a professor at the School of Architecture in Rosario. She served as a visiting professor at the School of Architecture and Urban Studies of the Torquato Di Tella University, and she is also an assistant in the School of MIT. Agustina, welcome. The floor is yours. Thank you for inviting me and for your presentation, Carolina. It is interesting to speak after Singapore's presentation because, as Carolina said, I work as the planning secretary in Rosario in Argentina, and we have the opposite case to Argentina. We have so much land and space. So planning is so we don't allow this expansion to be out of control. This is Rosario. It's between Córdoba and Buenos Aires City on the west side of the Paraná River, in front of the province of Entre Rios. And as you can see, the metropolitan area of Rosario is on the river, and it works a bit like a bottleneck of all the different loads and freight, because we do have the port there as well. Grain is moved and export through Rosario. So in that sense, we have a very important issue with regards to freight, but at the same time, as an urban designer and planning secretary, the way we plan cities and the metropolitan areas is important so that these two situations don't conflict with each other. This is the cities are not the problem, they are the solution, which is something Jaime Lerner said, to think of how we can plan to make it a good place to live. These are aerial images of the city of Rosario on the Paraná River. As you can see, it is denser on the coast and it loses density on the metropolitan area up until it gets to almost rural areas, which are pretty close to the city. This is something that from the planning of the metropolitan area, we're trying to preserve so we don't expand unlimited and the urban stain sort of continues. We can see here some pictures of Rosario with this 26 localities which are part of the metropolitan area. In Rosario, we have a municipality that has all of these localities and takes care of the planning of how they can grow so we can have policies that are agreed upon. So that's how we plan in different ways. And at this scale, I believe the mobility infrastructure is a bit like the axis on how we can grow. And in that sense, in the metropolitan area, if you take into account the main roads and freeways to see where we can get the urban state to grow for residential use, and also the hubs that we can get for logistics, productive industrial areas, so they don't interfere with the locality and with neighboring localities. These are some of the proposals that we're using in the metropolitan area. You can see here the development for railways and roads. Although now we only have freight trains, we are thinking of carrying it more and more to passenger services. And a proposal that we're analyzing is to do with also the river, the waterways transport, which at the moment is not very organized. Each person comes with their vehicle, with their own boat. So we're proposing now to have it more organized when it comes to waterway transport. And then we go to the different sectors in other scales, how we plan this. The local scale, in this case, I'm going to show it is an intermediate scale because this is Rosario, this is Funes and Barrucea. And here, how do we plan between the three localities, a sector that goes the airport and also some waterways and mobility or the freeways structure the urban development for that sector. And in Rosario itself, if you go into a smaller scale, you can see once again how the road structure helps to organize the movement in that area. These are different areas. And here we call the neighborhood scale, which is within the city. And we take the example of Cuarto de Hora city from Carlos Moreno, who says that you should change the paradigm of the modern city. And in that sense, we're trying to reinvent proximity, to give place to citizens' intervention and to help to get multiple centers. He talks about proximity of living, work, getting the things that you need, access to health, learning, and having fun. On the one hand, the urban code establishes where you can expand and what the density should be. And on the other hand, we need to check about construction code for each building and each structure in the city. Here, in the neighborhood scale, from the corridors of mobility, we could detect different neighborhood units, and you develop in a very small lot by lot scale to see what's in each lot and how can this take to changes within a corridor that is now only for vehicles to a place where you can have cycling lanes and pedestrians. These are other corridors in that we're seeing how to change. But when I was talking about the change of the construction code, we were talking about this, the Soft City by David Sin, which is interesting because he talks about the importance of the first 3 meters from the pavement up in the feeling of how you perceive the city. He says that the neighborhood is not a place, but a mental state. And also bringing Jane Jacobs in this idea of the neighborhood and the mixture of uses, we understand that it is important to be able to allow different uses of the space. In this equation of density by diversity is proximity. And to be able to achieve this, we realized that the rules should allow higher lower floor heights to be able to get more activities. And we're working on the project of the rules so we can change the code and get more proximity by lengthening the height of the lobby floor of the first floor so they are closer to the city. This is the different strategies or scales that we're using at the Metropolitan and how we're thinking about the city in future with regards to planning and transport. Thank you. Thank you, Agustina, for your presentation with regards to Rosario. I think, as you said at the beginning of your presentation, it is a good counterpoint to what Lutik Soon was telling us at the beginning with regards to Singapore, where the main problem is in Latin America has to do with the fact of the expansion of cities in an uncontrolled way or non-planned way, which then brings about many social problems and even with regards to the patterns for transport and the chance to use different transport modes and a lot of other impacts. And I believe it also reinforces the idea and the importance of participation. And you added a subject that means that we must plan at all scales, not only, it's no good to plan in just one particular way, but we must translate that to bigger, more regional or smaller or local scales as well. In order not to delay, I'm going to present now Christopher Segras. He is a professor of mobility and urban planning at department head of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the MIT. He teaches integrated land use transportation planning, quantitative methods, and transportation finance. His research spans interrelated areas critical to tackling metropolitan mobility challenges: human behavior, digital transformation, and strategic planning techniques and technologies. He worked for the International Institute for Energy Conservation in Washington, D.C. and Santiago de Chile, and for MIT's Laboratory for Energy and the Environment. He holds a BA in Economics and Spanish from the Tufts University, a Master in City Planning, and a Master in Science and Transportation from MIT, and a PhD in Urban and Regional Planning, also from the MIT. Welcome, Chris, and you have the floor.
Ven a mis láminas, ¿cierto?
Sí, perfecto.
You can see my... Thank you so much, Carolina, and everybody who is here in this conference. Thank you for the proposal. And to the other panelists, due to efficiency, I will speak in English. You can see my Spanish has suffered from lack of practice, and I'm going to try to speak about several subjects and are pretty complicated. So
as I said, I'll speak in English for the sake of efficiency. I'm not sure exactly whether the majority of folks here are Hispanoparlante or English or otherwise, but hopefully you'll understand me. This is the content for my talk today. Carolina gave me kind of a very large challenge of trying to provide a broad perspective on the linkages between transport systems and territorial development. I actually like the term territorial development. We often use land use when we talk about land use and transportation, or I often use the term the built environment, which reflects the spaces that we build for living, working, and so forth. I was asked to kind of give a broad overview of this and kind of a focus on global trends and obstacles and the importance of strategic planning and long-term planning. I think we've gotten a great two ends of a spectrum, so to speak, from what we heard from Agustina and Luc Tiexun. You know, we've seen like a great picture of Singapore, a place where I've had the great luck of working in a research center for the last decade. And how, you know, they've integrated economic instruments both on the land development side and on the transportation side with road pricing, as well as strategic planning. But, you know, as many of us might say, Singapore is also relatively unique institutionally and territorially. And so I'm going to take a few steps back and look at what we're trying to improve in this interrelationship between territory and mobility, that is metropolitan creation of accessibility. And where that accessibility comes from, and then what its implications are for the built environment and greenhouse gas emissions and decarbonization. And I'll briefly, you know, talk about some implications, but hopefully we can discuss those in more detail in the Q&A. I like this quote from Glaser, economist at Harvard, an urban economist. You know, why do we have cities? Well, basically because we as society, we as economies benefit from being closer together. We benefit from the reduced costs for goods, people, and ideas. We know we're in an urban age, and this urban age is because we appreciate the proximity. Now, of course, a lot of this is being questioned in the current crisis of COVID-19. However, you know, history would suggest that we will find a pathway out of this public health crisis, and cities as we know them will be different, but of course they won't go away. Accessibility, I like to use, when I talk about accessibility, this is why we come to places. This is why cities exist. They provide access to daily wants and needs, to school, to friends, to work, to products and services, recreational opportunities, etc. They provide us accessibility. This is the fundamental output that we get from cities, the outcome that we get to cities. And I would argue that sustainable mobility or a decarbonized mobility is maintaining the capability to provide this non-declining accessibility in time. So, you know, decarbonization must aim to maintain accessibility with low or no carbon. We cannot expand accessibility infinitely, especially in the carbon-constrained world, without balancing the need for expanded accessibility and the scarcity of the resources. In this case, the ability of our atmosphere to maintain a climate that we can all handle as beings. There are 5 basic elements of accessibility creation. Of course, we have mobility. With more links, faster links, and cheaper service, we have greater accessibility. The opportunities that are existing across the metropolitan area, then better opportunities means better accessibility. Accessibility. The quality of those opportunities, our ability as individuals to take advantage of them, and of course also the telecommunication system, or the virtual accessibility, which we're experiencing right now. None of us needed to travel to Argentina to participate in this conference today. In sum, we can think of this image, which I like, borrowing from Levine and others, where basically we can see clearly that mobility and proximity, so the territorial development and the mobility system, they both contribute to accessibility. More mobility will increase accessibility, more proximity will increase accessibility, but these two tend to act in contrast to each other. When you increase mobility, you tend to increase distances from people, because mobility systems themselves occupy space, but also they tend to lower the cost of travel and lower the difficulties in accessing more land. What in this particular image, what Levine called connectivity, I was referring to before as telecommunications or virtual accessibility. So if we're again thinking about this from a decarbonized mobility perspective, a decarbonized mobility system should be providing higher accessibility at lower carbon or zero carbon, but the same level of accessibility. we know that increased mobility without a zero carbon energy source will increase the carbon footprint of accessibility. So if we're looking towards ways of decreasing the carbon footprint of accessibility, we should be focusing on proximity. And just as these two systems interact to generate accessibility, the land use or the territorial system and the mobility system, these two systems, of course, interact with each other. The land use system determines where trip origins and destinations are. It influences the relative attractiveness of different travel modes. The mobility system, in turn, influences the relative desirability of different places, properties, houses, offices, and so forth. And so these two systems interact, and a major transportation investment, for example, will change the accessibility profile across a metropolitan area and also, of course, change the carbon footprint. You know, another way of looking at this is in the classic bid rent curve, you know, first generated for modern urban systems by Alonso in the 1960s, and a Harvard economist. And basically, we can see in this graph that if you look at that CBD, the central business district, that node, that concentration of accessibility, this model will basically predict that land uses and prices reflect the relative attractiveness of being towards that concentration. And when someone is trying to acquire land, that person is acquiring two different goods, the land and the location in a single transaction. And this is showing the trade-off. Quantity of land versus the transport costs. And of course, there's other attributes of that location as well. And if we use this, this bid rent framework, then you can see what happens when you make a transportation investment, that dotted line. It will increase the distance that's desirable and attractive to any locating agent. I'm thinking of this in the terms of the utility of a household, but it can also be the profit margins for a firm. They will buy some of that transport benefit and give up some of the proximity benefit. So this will grow an urban area outward. It will reduce the density of a given node. And of course, this will also tend to be associated with greater carbon intensity. Yeah, I apologize for these two. This is a residuals, similar images before. Now this, today, of course, we live in modern metropolitan areas. That traditional bid rent curve varies across the metropolitan area, but the same kind of idea still holds with a lot of imperfections and distinctions in any given place. So now let's turn this to the question of decarbonization more specifically. Here I'm using GHGs as a shorthand for greenhouse gas emissions. If we're looking at the territorial dimension to mobility decarbonization, I'm going to return to the framework of Lee Shipper, the late great Lee Shipper, who popularized the as-if framework, where as-if is activities, mode share, fuel intensity, and fuel type. Various factors influence each of the components. Let's start with activities. So this is the distance. Here I'm using it for passenger kilometers traveled, but you can imagine a similar, and it's analogous for goods transport. This is distance, the number of trips times the distance. Land use or the territorial development clearly influences this, because the larger the metropolitan area, all else equal, the longer the distances people will travel on average. Then we also see mode share. This is the share of that PKM, the passenger kilometers traveled, by different modes. Again, we know the built environment influences this, because you can influence the attractiveness of different modes, pedestrian, public transport, and so forth. We saw some of this in the case of the towns that Singapore is working to develop, such as Punggol. So the built environment also, the territorial development also influences mode share. In fact, it also can influence fuel intensity, which is the amount of fuel consumed by those passengers in each mode. Because, for example, the built environment can influence the tendency of occupation of vehicles, occupancy of vehicles, whether they be cars, buses, trains, and so forth. And finally, we can imagine that the built environment might even influence, excuse me, fuel choice. This is the the carbon intensity of any given fuel, because, for example, electric vehicles might do better in certain types of built environments, because electric vehicles can be made more efficient if they're smaller, and they might be able to navigate much smaller neighborhoods, such as you see the proliferation of electric two-wheelers in many parts of Asia. So this is the basic framework. Now the question is, what does this mean for the built environment? Agustina and referred to this a little bit when she was talking about the different scales. I mean, when we're thinking about territorial development, this is what urban planning has been doing forever in terms of trying to influence how we form our cities for getting particular mobility outcomes. You can think of this in terms of you know, the Garden City movement from the late 1800s to the Newtown movement in the United States in the 1950s to today what we call, you know, new urbanism and so forth. These are all operating at different scales, whether it's controlling the form of the metropolitan area or modifying the form of the neighborhood. Each of these, as we said, can influence greenhouse gas emissions and our ability to decarbonize, thus our territorial systems. So in metropolitan areas, the influences of the built environment essentially play out at I would say 3 different spatial scales. I don't know if you can see my pointer here, but the kind of the metropolitan scale, this is a classic Newman and Kenworthy graph where you can see kind of Singapore and Santiago down here and the US cities way up here. You can see a schematic of the different types of forms at this level. Of course, the distribution, this is a map of Chicago in the middle, which shows kind of the distribution of activities across the metropolitan area, which also influences the attractiveness of travel modes. And then the way a particular neighborhood can be laid out. For example, you know, traditional suburban developments, US style versus a more kind of block and grid framework of what might be called a neo-traditional development in the United States context. The challenge, of course, is that how the built environment does eventually impact behavior and thus carbon emissions in the mobility sector. They're very complex and ambiguous. People ultimately make their own choices. And so just because you build a low carbon neighborhood doesn't guarantee you'll get low carbon behavior. And I don't have the time to belabor this now, but perhaps we could talk about it. But ultimately, we need empirics to decide what will be the carbon outcomes of particular urban forms from the metropolitan scale all the way down to the local and neighborhood scale. I don't have time to belabor this, but this is kind of the density of metropolitan areas across the world, from the highly dense Asian cities at the very bottom to the low density US metropolitan areas up in the red at the top. But I wanted to just give a sense of a couple of results from a couple of places that I know reasonably well. One is Santiago de Chile. This is a graph which demonstrates the elasticity of household mobility emissions with respect to various dimensions of relevance. And so I know this is probably too much to digest here, but this blue bar, for example, is the CO2 emissions. The other bars are other emissions of importance, such as respirable particulates, volatile organic compounds, and nitrogen oxide. So we can see, for example, that income, household income, clearly drive emissions. More income means more emissions of CO2 and everything else except the reduction of PM10 because high income households use buses less. But the other elasticities, and these are partial elasticities, meaning you can add them all up, and it shows, in fact, that various dimensions of relative location in the metropolitan area, relative location vis-a-vis the rail system, and then of various forms of urban development at that local scale that Agustina was talking about, actually in combination can offset the income effect. So the lesson here, in my view, is you can actually continue getting richer, but actually mitigate the carbon impacts of that if you design your cities properly. The other place I wanted to show a quick example of some empirics from is the United States, where we're a very carbon intensive country, the most carbon gluttonous. Transportation is an important share of this. And again, some evidence shows that transportation, just this last example, just moving from single family development units, so the typical suburbanization in the United States, to multifamily dwelling units, that means apartments, is actually the way that singly can reduce emissions the most. So this is not only because the household itself becomes more efficient because the thermal efficiencies of the units, but also those types of development units tend to be in places that are more efficient. This is consistent with more recent analysis that's been done in the United States looking at gasoline sales, which I don't have the time to get into now. I see that I'm over my own 15 minutes, so I just will leave us with a couple of implications. If we go back out to the broadest scale, there's a recent typologization of cities across the world, 500 different metropolitan areas. And the suburb outward growth is what's happening the most. In fact, across North America, Europe, China, East Asia, South Asia, Central and South America, and the rest of the world. So this budding outward means we're still developing new cities. We're still developing new metropolitan areas. We're growing outward. So this actually gives us an opportunity to shape the future. So can we move, say, that budding outward to a budding upward? So we start densifying that suburban growth. That I think is helping us to lock in a carbon future, which will have at least lower mobility intensivity in creating accessible spaces that are in fact moving us towards decarbonization. I will end it there because I realize I've gone at least 2 minutes over time, and I appreciate your patience and attention.
Muchas gracias, Chris, por...
Thank you, Chris, for your presentation. I believe this gives us a more academic perspective with data and graphs with regards to different experiences, and it strengthens the vision of the need to plan. And as the data you showed, there is a very close link between the patterns of land use and occupation and the patterns for development and the ways to try to get less greenhouse gases. I believe that is the central point of today's discussion. I am thankful. And now I will insist and tell everybody that you can ask questions for the panelists. And I would also like to remind you that interpretation is available for those who need it, whether in Spanish or English. I now introduce Marelia Martinez Rivas. She is a specialized consultant in freight logistics and trade facilitation. She has worked for the public sector in Venezuela, as well as international organizations such as the CAF, the IDB, ISEI, CLAC, and UNDP. She helped develop the IRSA network and several national transport plans for different South American countries. She conducted national plans for Central America and trained over 160 sectorial stakeholders with the support of the Intal ADB and the CEDET Foundation from Spain. She has an MSc in urban transport from Universidad Simón Bolívar from Venezuela and an MSc in business administration from the ESCP EAP from France, focusing on the logistics sector. With that, Marelia, you have the floor.
Marelia, estás silenciada.
¿Ahora?
Ahí sí.
Aquí
Gracias.
sí. Gracias, Carolina. Gracias a todos. Yo había pensado hacer la presentación en inglés, pero veo que hay muchísimos participantes en español. Entonces, si no les importa, las láminas están en inglés, pero voy a hablar en español. No creo que haya problemas, ¿no?
The presentation is in English on the screen, but I will speak in Spanish.
Bueno, esta presentación es un producto un poco la experiencia de varios años.
The experience I've had in many years, something that began in 89 when I was still in Venezuela.
Bueno, fue un proceso de maduración progresivo,
and it was a progressive process of how we were able to go for logistics. I'm going to speak about the relationship between territory and transport of goods, what are the trends and the beliefs with regards to all the countries that have begun to work in logistic planning, and what are the premises that countries take when they want to do logistic plan. And I'm going to talk about that in national and regional strategies to do with logistics in Latin America, although some of these applications, the methodology of freight logistics I have used in Western Africa as well, to try their applicability in different contexts. So mainly I'm talking about the Latin American experience.
Primero, no hay ninguna duda en el desarrollo de un territorio que
the development of a given territory is inseparable from transport infrastructure and services. But the current complexity of logistic chains introduces new challenges when it comes to policy making and planning. In the transport of goods, physical accessibility must be accompanied by a set. It's not only to do with physical accessibility, but it must be accompanied by a set of transport and logistic services and the access to different types of goods and their flows. External trade operations, the control processes, are becoming more and more complex and demanding, and it creates additional challenges. New issues related to COVID-19 add up to the already complex control framework of all the export, and if you want to bring goods into the country or move within the territory. And logistic chains and their flows must be well organized in order to reach their best potential in accordance with the development objectives that were organized for a particular territory. I'm going to tell you something about how this began. In 1989, I was working in Venezuela on a big rail project which aimed to reduce emissions. We didn't talk about decarbonization, but there was this need to try and lower the emissions. We had big companies that were using that railway, and we had done all of the viability, feasibility studies, and we were at the final areas, and a consulting firm hired me to do the impact studies to do with transport and urbanization. But I am curious, so I decided to interview the paper producers, the iron and the pallets producers for bulk, and I was surprised to see that many were saying, no way, we're not going to use the railways. Our logistic patterns will not allow for that. The way we have organized distribution does not correspond to what this system was made to. And that, to me, was the first alarm. How are they doing the goods transportation? And that was a process that began to, I'm talking about 89, and we are where we are now. When it comes to logistic plans, they are the new normal. This is, in Latin America, we don't no longer talk about transport plans. We talk about logistic plans. All of the countries from the year 2000, we all have these logistics plans. Some update these road or transport plans, but everybody has a logistics plan. So we began a phase that was road plans, then we went on to transport plan,
aparece una cosa
and
que
then
se llama
we saw trade and transport facilitation,
pero que se focalizaba mucho
but
en
is
los nodos de
focused,
comercio
it
exterior.
used to be
Había un
focused
énfasis
on
muy
the
importante
foreign
en los
trade
nodos de comercio exterior
nodes,
bajo la premisa de que
under the
si el
premise
Estado podía
that if
intervenir,
the
debía
state
intervenir en
could
aquellos
intervene,
puntos
it
donde se
should
generaban
do
los
so
problemas
in the hubs
aparentemente
where
más
the problem
ruidosos, ¿no?
arose,
Era
the
que se
biggest
consideraban los más
problems
importantes
that
por
were
ser los más
considered the most
ruidosos,
important because
que
they
eran
were
las
the
aduanas no
noisiest one,
funcionan,
which
los
were
puertos
to
son
do with
ineficientes, los
customs
aeropuertos
being
no tienen instalaciones de
inefficient,
inspección adecuadas, y se
ports
genera
being
toda esta
inefficient,
tendencia de trade and
airports
transport
being
facilitation.
inefficient,
Pero
etc.
aparece
So
entonces
trade and
los planes de
transport
logística de
facilitation
carga,
turned up, and then we get to freight
como
logistics
diciendo
plan,
tenemos que ir un poquito más allá,
saying
pero
we need to go a bit
en
beyond
esos
that.
primeros
But
planes de logística
in
de
this
carga
first plans for
empezaron a
freight
hacer
logistics,
unos nuevos planes de infraestructura, ¿no?
they began with
O
new infrastructure
sencillamente
plans
planes de
or
transporte, de comercio y
trade and
facilitación de
transport
transporte
facilitation
con el
plan
nombre de logística, pero al
with the
final eran las
new
mismas
name
cosas,
of
se
logistics, but
focalizaban
it meant the
en lo que
same. It was
pasaba en los nodos de
focused on
comercio
what was
exterior.
happening in the
Entonces,
foreign
los
trade
primeros planes y los planes que
hubs.
se han
The
hecho
first
después, ¿no? De
plans
toda la
that
iniciativa,
were
yo he
done
hecho
afterwards,
8 planes en América
I did 8
Central
plans
y
in
participé
Central
directamente en
America,
los
and I
planes de
participated
logística de
in
Colombia, de
logistic
Perú,
plans in Colombia,
unos planes
Peru,
que se hicieron en Ecuador,
the ones that
en
were
el década
carried
del
out in
2000, o
Ecuador,
sea, varios planes, ¿no? O
so
sea,
in
además de
many of
África del
these.
Oeste,
Then Western
Ruanda, o sea,
Africa
yo he
as well,
participado en
Rwanda.
varios planes, ¿no?
So I
Y yo
participated
no me he
in many of
encontrado
these,
un solo
and I
plan
have not found
en que el
one
país diga que no
plan
tiene una localización
where the country
estratégica.
says that it
Todos
doesn't
los
have a
países
location
consideran que
is
tienen
not
una
strategic.
localización
They all
estratégica,
consider
¿no?
it to have a
Porque
strategic
visto
location.
desde el hecho de que si
Because
la vista interna con relación a
the
los
internal
demás hace
perspective
pensar a
with
los
regards to
países
others
que ellos
makes the
tienen
countries think
activos
that
que
they
son más
have
importantes que los
assets
demás
that are more
y que ellos tienen
important than others
condiciones
and that
mejores
they
que los
have
demás
better
para
conditions than
atraer,
others
¿no?
to
Para
attract
atraer las mercancías que están en tránsito,
the goods
sumado
that
a la
are in
moda
transit,
Singapur,
plus
aprovechando que
the
tenemos a nuestro
Singapore
experto de Singapur.
fashion.
Todo el mundo ve Singapur como
Everybody
un caso
sees
de éxito y de alguna
Singapore
manera
as
quiere
a
copiar
successful
esa
case, and everybody wants to
experiencia y esa
copy
buena
that
práctica.
experience and those
Pero
good
¿qué pasa?
practices.
O sea,
But
¿cómo
what
es
happens?
el proceso mental para
What
esto?
is the mental
Los
process
puertos
needed for
están,
this?
tenemos
The
unos puertos que
ports
están localizados estratégicamente,
are
y a veces
strategically
aeropuertos.
located.
Esos
Sometimes they're
flujos principales los
airports.
podemos capturar con
Those
un poco de
can be
marketing, un poco
captured
de
with a bit of
acciones
marketing,
adecuadas, un
with
poco
a
de
bit of
infraestructura. Y por esa
infrastructure,
razón nuestro país es un
the main
hub de
flows, and the
transporte, ¿no?
country is in
Pero
fact a
como un
transport
hub de
hub.
transporte puede ser un hub logístico.
But it
O
could
sea,
be a
eso es como una
logistics
conclusión
hub.
natural en
That
esta
is
ola
the
de
natural
pensamiento, ¿no?
conclusion in this thought.
Pero ¿qué ha pasado? Que el énfasis que se le ha
But
dado
what's
a la
happening is the
creación de los hubs
emphasis
logísticos, que
that is
como les
placed in the
digo,
creation of a
en todos los
logistics
países
hub
lo hemos visto,
with all countries,
eso
we've seen
hizo a
this,
que se
can lead
sobreestimaran las capacidades
to
nacionales en
overestimating
ese objetivo
national
específico,
development capabilities in these particular
y
place,
se descuidaron cosas, ¿no?
and
que eran
they
necesarias, como reducir
overlooked
los costos
things that were so important,
optimizar las
such as
redes
reducing
nacionales
logistic costs,
para los
using national networks
productos, de todo el flujo de productos de comercio
for
exterior de
the
un país.
flow of
Entonces
foreign
eso se
trade
pasó
goods
a
from
un
all over the
segundo
country.
plano, ¿no?
That went on to a
Entonces,
second.
¿de
Nobody
dónde
really
salen
thought
entonces
about
los
it.
planes de
So
logística? En
where
los
do
años
these
2000,
logistic
yo comencé
plans
a
come
colaborar
from?
con
In
el
the
Banco Interamericano de
2000,
Desarrollo
I
para
began
conseguir una estrategia de cómo
working
el
with
banco
the
podía
IDB to see
apoyar a los
how
países.
the bank could support
Esta demanda
countries
que había de hacer
with
nuevos
a growing
desarrollos de
request
sus servicios
to
logísticos, cómo
support the
hacer planes
development of
logísticos,
national
cómo hacer proyectos
logistics plans,
logísticos,
how
pero no
to
se sabía, el banco no
aid the
sabía qué era
logistics, but the
logística y
bank
cómo
did
el
not
banco
know
podía
what was
apoyar.
logistics and how they could
Logística era
support
una cosa que
it.
naturalmente se consideraba
Logistics
que
were
era algo
naturally
del
that was
sector privado.
considered to be
Yo había tenido
part
mi
of the
experiencia en
private
Venezuela,
sector.
entre
I
estas y
had the
otras cosas que les
experience
conté. Yo
in
coordiné un gran
Venezuela.
estudio de transporte de carga, fue de
I
los primeros
did
estudios
a
de transporte de
big
carga que se hicieron en la región en el
study
año
of
92,
freight
93,
transport in 92,
exclusivamente para
93,
transporte de carga.
exclusively for freight
Y el
transport.
reto era eso, el reto era ir más allá
And the
de
challenge was
trade
to
and
go
transport
beyond trade and
facilitation, ¿no? O sea,
transport
todo lo que era
facilitation,
comercio y facilitación del
anything to
transporte.
do with this.
Tuvimos unos pioneros, ¿no?
We
Los
did
países
have some
pioneros fueron
pioneers. The
Perú, Colombia y
pioneering
Ecuador,
countries were Peru,
que elaboraron
Colombia,
sus
and
primeros planes de logística
Ecuador,
de carga,
who did the
igual como algunos
first
proyectos
national freight
sectoriales.
logistics plan with
Estos
some
primeros planes fueron
projects in
desarrollados
particular.
con
These first
consultoría, o sea,
plans
de la misma
were
forma
done
como
with
se
consulting firms. They did the terms of reference, they hired consulting firms who did who didn't know about logistics, they knew about transport.
Entonces, y en esa época también, en
And in that time, in parallel, we introduced the IRSA initiative, the Initiative of Regional Integration in South America. And what are the lessons we learned in this first phase? First of all, the logistics as a service sector needs to be harmonized with national development strategies in other sectors, including land development, because the country thinks it's a hub. But if there is a depressed region in the country, they will say, let's do some logistic here. They don't really know what it is, but they plan to do that in that depressed area because that's what's going to help that area to grow. Intrinsically, the public planner thinks that logistics is the new tool for territorial development. But in the same fashion, when you begin to do logistic planning, this is a cross-cutting sector. It brings things from transport, it includes subsectorial organization, ports, airports, things to do with facilitation of trade and things to do with service. So when you do a logistics plan and you do it with a private consulting firm, what happens is that the country is expecting the new projects, but in general, the first plans that were carried out were done by infrastructure or institutions to do with infrastructure. So people wanted to see hard projects, solid. I mean, for infrastructure. And therefore, they began to generate projects, plans with a lot of logistic platforms without really understanding the role that these logistic plans had when it came to optimizing the flow. And they interviewed some key stakeholders, but without involving them in the process, that wanted to optimize coordination across all areas. So the infrastructure plans were generated, they were identified, but because there were companies that did infrastructure works, things to do with operation, control, and trade were very superficial. So many projects for platforms that tried to begin, as soon as this happened, they failed because they had not talked about the implications properly when it came to control process, how they're going to pay, how much this was going to cost for the freight person to have that additional step. What did that mean in terms of goods that were perishable, for example? There were whole things that they hadn't taken into account. And they assumed that by optimizing the supply, for example, I do the infrastructure, I establish regulations for services, or I try to optimize as a government anything to do with external trade operations, foreign trade operations. I think that by just using that, the supply area, you can actually conduct a harmonized logistics system, because in Latin America, and emerging countries, there have been important efforts with regards to diversifying exports, non-traditional exports that are small and they're not optimized. And what happens is that many a time, optimizing the chain is what will have an effect in that logistics sector, to use the infrastructure controls, etc. You need to make the chain mature and have all the stakeholders involved. And therefore, to understand how logistics supply chains work was key to know what was necessary and how the government could help and focus on, and what the private sector should do. Due to that, we saw the methodology for drawing up freight logistics plans. The bank asked me to coordinate these for Latin America, I said, we're not going to be able to do this. We can do it as a technical assistance. It is technical assistance between the public and private sectors that began in Dominican Republic, Costa Rica, and in the end, it was part of the Mesoamerica project. But we did the plans for Nicaragua, Guatemala, Belize, El Salvador, and they are published. And this was a process for technical assistance, really. It was a process where it was at a strategic level. We weren't interested in doing quantitative analysis, but to understand the issues at hand and to understand the aspects where the stakeholders were willing to help and what was the feeling with regards to the most important projects. These plans were supported in three big areas: supply, infrastructure services, and anything to do with legal, financial, and the analysis of the supply chains to see how we can segment that, because before they had tried to do a mapping of chains that was too exhausting, that we had so much data we didn't know what to do with it. So we methodologically did a process of how to segment these chains, to focus on which areas, and in that exercise we mapped chains with all participants, because part of the process was to get the same construction of how a chain works, for example, with a custom agent that we found between the producer, the transport person, and the custom, to see how they coordinated between the different actors, and anything to do with territory, because logistics happens in a territory, and you need to optimize the networks that work in the territory. To give you an example, here you can see the demand. This is in Guatemala. They focused on these particular logistic sectors to do with agro-export, perishable goods, forestry, regional commerce, etc. And in the case of supply, they talked about the infrastructure to do with ports, borders, etc., services, processes. And here you can see institutional, legal, and financial complementary components. And in the territory, you can see where are the main conglomerates. You can see that there's a lot of concentration of activity, because logistics is not an isolated thing. It is a cluster in the territory, and those clusters have their own set of rules. So you're going to have a cluster in a country. So we decided to call them conglomerates. And these conglomerates have hierarchies. They could be first the port and then the airport, but not only for transport. The node for transport plus the logistic infrastructure plus all the services that are there. And this whole set needs to be optimized. So the plans would go from a national to identify the conglomerates and to optimize them. And then, of course, the nodes that we call the smaller areas. This methodology is in the final revision in order to be published. It is corrected after many years of seeing, about 7 years of trying to see the methodological, and it is pretty much close to being published. The phases, there is a first phase, which is the demand segmentation. This is done with representatives from the private sector of the country in order to be sure that everybody sees their needs reflected.
ese proceso de diálogo inicia desde el mismo momento en que uno empieza a planificar los primeros talleres,
from the beginning that you start planning the first workshops. The selection of the institutional network with the same segmentation of demand, you know that you must invite producers of different goods or textiles or vegetables, depending upon the country, and this will have a different confirmation. You need to analyze
la situación actual de la
oferta y la demanda con información secundaria, pero con mucho trabajo en taller, y se llega a una conclusión sobre la estructura y of the national logistics system that judges the demand and the supply. What is the level of maturity that we have in all of those segments? Then the strategic agenda and the action plan, the strategic challenges, the agenda, what are the mission and the objectives, an action plan with a target image, which is an image, we didn't want to call it a plan, it is an image of what the logistics should be like in the future, and then the implementation strategy. In some countries in the region, these immediate action plans were so that the bank could generate loans to reform policies to support anything to do with institutional, like in Honduras, for example, I'm working there in the logistics law in the region. It is the first one. So there's many things that come out, and they are product of that consensus that we can actually reach with private and public sector. Just to mention that you've got just one more minute.
Sí, esa es la última, ¿no? Esto es solamente un ejemplo
that is the last one. This is just an example
este tipo de consideraciones entran. Esto no
the type of considerations that come in one of the plans. This is a work I carried out with Peru with the facilitation plan for commerce. They wanted to use this in the case of Peru.
Por ejemplo, uno de los elementos
For example, one of the elements that were very important in the analysis was to decide we have all of the merchandise in Peru goes through the Callao port. Not quinoa, for example, it is produced in the south of Peru, which is here in the border with Bolivia, and they must move to be transported to El Callao because all of that forces it to go to El Callao. In that exercise that we carried out, the idea is to have concessions of ports and to have some important road network, but the services and the foreign trade has not been optimized to make sure that all exporters from the north and the south can have all the elements that they need logistically in order to be able to reduce their carbon footprint and to optimize their transport. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you, Marelia, for sharing your presentation, especially. I think that in the narrative of today's presentations, you double-clicked in the specific relationship between freight transport, which is what this conference has been focused on, and many previous discussions with regards to the interrelationship between trade with different modes of transport, the need to integrate rail to ports, to the strategies of where goods are created and where they are consumed, etc. So I thank you for the vision you gave, and now I will introduce the last panelist for today, which is Seong-Kuk Woo. He's a senior researcher in the Korea Transport Institute, Director of Traffic Operation and Personal Mobility Research Team. His major research area is policy development for sustainable transport. He conducted studies on mitigation of greenhouse gases emission in transport sector and improvement of pedestrian and personal mobility environment. Prior to his work at the Korea Transport Institute, he was a postdoctoral fellow in the Georgia Institute of Technology, And he also worked for several years as a transportation engineer at Yushin Engineering Corporation in Korea. He received his PhD in civil engineering from the Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta in 2009 and a BS and MS in civil engineering from the Seoul National University. Welcome. You have the floor.
Thank you, Carolina. Nice to meet you all participants from world. Let me share my screen. Okay. I'm going to talk about the high-speed railway impacts on regional economy in Korea. The high-speed railway adopted in Korea relatively recently compared with Japan and European countries, but it has a huge impact on the regional economy in Korea. I'm going to skip some slides. This is the network. From Seoul to Busan is like a 400 kilometers long. From Seoul to Mokpo is 250 kilometers long. And this Seoul-Busan corridor was complete in 2010. And the Seoul-Mokpo corridor completed in 2015. It's a relatively very recent. Let's see changes in transport. Just see the travel time from Seoul to Busan. The conventional train, I mean the slow speed train, it takes 4 hours and 10 minutes. But the KTX is a brand name of a high-speed rail in Korea, Korea Train Express. It takes 2 hours, 90 minutes. So your time saving is 100 minutes. And as of 2013, the coverage area, the coverage population is 60% of this country. The ridership at the opening, it was 54,000 passengers a day in 2004. This graph is a little bit outdated, so I put the most recent statistics. As of 2018, 232,000 passengers a day. Modal shift from Seoul to Busan. If you use KTX, it takes 2 hours, 40 minutes. If you use your car, it's 4 hours, 40 minutes. And the cost is almost same. Like 60,000 won. So before the KTX, the rail mode share was 36%. Now KTX, the rail share is almost 60%. And what you should see is the automobile, the passenger car mode share was 21%. Now it is only 7%. So the major theme of this seminar is decarbonizing transport. So in terms of that context, the high-speed railway is very much effective in decarbonizing transport in Korea. This is another example from Honam line, but let me skip to save time. The stationary development strategy in high-speed rail sector is multimodal transport complex, which integrates all transport modes like high-speed rail, local metro, bus, and taxi, etc. And by combining all modes, you may have a local and intercity traffic increase, and that increase gives new business opportunities. We have 4 study pilot stations. Dongdaegu was complete in 2016, and Ulsan, Gwangju, and Iksan station are still under planning. Let's see the Dongdaegu station, the result. We spent $1 billion US, and the major developer was Shinsegae, which is second largest shopping business. The business, like a department store in Korea. The facility has high-speed rail and bus terminal, also culture and education, theme park, department store, and many other retail shops. So after this complex is complete, the ridership increased by 60%. And the ridership of connected metro, the local metro, increased by 40%. And the number of visitors is 33 million per year. And the revenue of the department store is 660 billion Korean won in a year. This is a newspaper article to describe this complex development. I'm sorry, this is in Korean. Let me transcript. This area was old and not attractive. I'm sorry. There are many transit stations, but they are not connected. Now, after the complex is done, there are many people coming to this area, and the ridership increased. And what is interesting is there are many new apartment. The residential apartment was open, and the land price gets higher, and there are many restaurants and cafes opening. So this project kind of boosts the local economy. Let's see economic impacts. This is high-speed rail development model. The high-speed railway combined with the multimodal transport complex, it gives attractiveness and higher accessibility. So the station becomes an activity center. And in city level, you have growth from population growth. You have industrial development conditions, and your city image improves. In the nationwide level, you have a better accessibility in a long distance trip. So you have a better business opportunities, and the employment and revenue increases, nationally grows. The ridership in terms of person kilometer as of 2018, one person in Korea travels 400 kilometers by rail. The one shows the ridership change of Bundang line. So before and after, you can see the jump up of the ridership of the local metro. And the low one is the revenue of the Gwangju Metro. You can see the blue one is before KTX, the red one is after KTX. So you can see a big difference in revenue. And also we have seen the population growth in the cities which is connected to high-speed rail, such as city of Cheongju, a 33% increase from 2013 to 2016. Asan and Ulsan, Miryang, Kimcheon, we have a higher population growth than those cities not connected to high-speed rail. And this graph shows number of employee change over access time. So as you close to the station, you have a more increase in number of employee in the health sector and the education sector. This graph shows 4 apartment complex price. So I'm sorry, this is all Korean, but you can see the vertical line means the opening of the KTX. So after KTX connected, the apartment price goes up. So let me talk about the lesson learned. So in Korea, high-speed rail had positive impacts on the regional economy, revenue, employment, population, land price, local transit ridership increased, and the more passengers and more provided business opportunities. And as you see, the station development is very important, but the coordination is crucial for the success. You should overcome many hurdles, the coordination among stakeholders, regulations, and many different plans. And there are long and difficult negotiations between stakeholders for the station area development project. So you need creativity to such as in how to share risk and profit, and how to facilitate the land acquisition process. And finally, local leadership is very important, because the major benefit, the station area development, major benefit of this development goes to city. So the major coordinator is a city. So the Dongdaegu multimodal transit complex was possible thanks to local strong leadership. And in the previous table, we have 3 other stations, and their project is under planning for about 10 years, but it couldn't reach agreement between the stakeholders. So it is hard to make the project, but the most important factor is the local government leadership. Thank you. This is the end of my presentation today.
Muchísimas gracias, Seung-Kook, por tu
Thank you so much, Seung-Kook Woo, for your presentation. It was very interesting to see the development of high-speed trains. Years ago in Argentina, we discussed the possibility of developing that type of transport between some strategic cities. And it had always been a controversial issue due to the difficulties that you mentioned with regards to the different perspectives and the challenges of articulating that type of process. With that, before we continue on to questions, I think it's important to thank everybody for their presentations. It's been very nice to listen to every one of you and to learn from the different experience and know-how that you have brought. We've received quite a few questions during the session, so I'm going to try to answer as many as we can in order to make the most of the time we have. I'm going to go to the first question that I had for Luc Tae-Soon with regards to, you were talking about the experience in Singapore in this whole planning process that you've been carrying out for the last few decades. And the question is, how has the process been when it comes to governance and decision-making and articulation between the different agencies that participated when it comes to articulating the aims in terms of territorial development, transport, and the benefits it generates?
Okay. Decision-making process, very interesting. Like any other cities, because the way the government is set up, there are different agencies with different objectives. The way we do it is we go through a formal process of, we call it at the highest level, master plan committee. We do have a committee that is chaired by the chief planner. It has members from different agencies, including transport, land transport, you have health, you have parks and recreation, the national parks, you have the ministry in charge of the ports, the airport, etc. So the committee would deliberate some of the proposals, submissions, weigh the pros and cons, and do some considered objective evaluation and make some recommendation to the minister, through the chief planner, and then to the minister for endorsement. So there's some institutional process that we go through. That is the formal side of the house. The informal part is there's a lot of collaboration at the working level. People, when I was younger, we go through the process, we discuss, we debate. Sometimes it's not easy. We have different views, competing objectives. But at the same time, as I mentioned before, we always have a vision. So the alignment comes from the vision and comes from some of the common interests. For example, land is scarce. So we all know we're going to make the best use of the land, and therefore the consideration, there's some agreement on how best we can do it within the constraints as given. So we recognize constraint, we look at long-term and make certain trade-off and decision in the process. It's not easy, but we have formal process as well as at working level, a lot of collaborations. I hope I explained that answer.
Lu, Tixun te pregunta.
When it comes to the follow-up to this question, one of the participants was asking whether legislation or the Constitution of Singapore thinks about these planning processes. What does it allow at law level, regulatory, to these processes? Or is that something that happens from the executive decision of governments, whether there's something established in law and constitution?
Okay, I know what, yes. It is by law, in the legislation, a lot of the power, the legislative power of the agency is given through the parliament that passes the law. Now, in the execution, people like Land Transport Authority, the execution, we do have some power to make regulation, rules, control measures, to implement certain schemes within the power that's given. So because we adhere to a parliamentary democracy, which is like the British system, it's a central government, all the way from the cabinet, the highest level, to the minister of transport is the highest that our ministry is involved, and all the way down to the agency within the ministry. So there's legislation, there's statute, there are acts inside in the Singapore law that allows the agency to exercise certain rules or to promulgate or to put in place rules and regulations to execute that decision. Okay. If the question that whoever asked the question is interested, a lot of our laws are actually online and they're public information. You can take a look, and you have certain follow-up that you're not sure, you can always email me directly, which I will explain more. Okay.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I'm going to continue with something that is related to this question with regards to governance, which is a question for Agustina. They're asking, what is the articulation from the coordination organism of the metropolitan area of Rosario when it comes to develop or limiting strategies to limit urban expansion? And this is to do with how you can articulate these strategies in less dense areas that may involve some additional cost or inefficiency when you extend services to that faraway area. I am the planning secretary for Rosario, but I worked for 4 years in the Metropolitan Coordination Secretariat, so I know how they work. What they did is the ELECOM, which is to do the urban planning for the 26 localities. It was a participatory thing between the local technicians and this agency. From that, they established areas for growth or expansion, areas to keep reserved, and non-urban areas that could be rural areas or recreation areas. One of the other questions that was mentioned in the chat, they were saying that in Argentina we have too many urban plans, but then we don't have the ability to make it a regulation, and that is the truth. We need to actually turn this into local regulations, especially you need to have political will through time, especially in the different localities where every 2 years you change the communal president, so to speak. So you need political will through the years to be able to maintain this with a strong foothold. And that, the technical is not, otherwise is kind of lost in the politics of it. I don't know if I was clear. Yes, of course, you were. And I want to ask something as a follow-up to what you are saying, which has to do with something that was asked in one of the sessions, which is how do you approach the specific development between the interstitial areas between railways and roads? These are spaces where gated neighborhoods pop up with very little connectivity. They're not organic to the city, or sometimes they're vacant lots that don't have a use and its value is somehow wasted. I think the potential that you have for this in Rosario, for many years we've had urban plans. They are maintained through different governments, but in localities that don't have this history, I think the strength of developing a plan is especially that, not to get a different plan every time you get to transform the area into a vacant lot or into a gated neighborhood, but to try and say, okay, we want to consolidate this area so it has particular specific services, and to leave other areas for production, peri-urban, for food producing ages, or an area between residential and rural areas. The key is in planning and sustaining the planning through the different public policies. With that, I'm going to ask Hyun-Kook Woo, what has been the experience in Korea when you developed the high-speed trains? As you were telling us, sometimes the railways that these infrastructures have may be obstacles, or they may be a challenge when it comes to the immediacy of other types of connectivity. I wanted to know whether you can talk to us a bit about the experience in Korea in articulating those urban spaces that are near the railways, and how have you articulated that with cities?
Okay. In many metropolitan cities in Korea, the stations are old, and the operator of the railway, which is Korail, has a huge space. So usually the train station has a big plaza. So after the station becomes a high-speed rail station, the railway operator gives the land for that complex, and private investor gives the construction money. So if they agree to that development, the citizens have a multimodal transportation complex, also shopping mall. That's very good for a citizen. But the difficulty is like this. The developer, the one gives the money, want to have more facilities in that building, like movie theaters and many shops. But the city want to regulate. Maybe if there are so many people attracting facilities in that building, maybe the traffic management is very hard. So the investor wants more space, but the city want to regulate. So that's kind of big difference in their interest. So it is hard to coordinate that part. Do I answer your question?
Brevemente sí, creo que...
Yes, I think you highlight the fact that there are opposing interests due to the different stakeholders. And in that sense, I think we have reinforced the message that the biggest challenge in this issue is the articulation and the joint work that needs to be carried out in order to develop plans, whether they are strategic for development of transport or territory, that take into account the relationship between the different interests. I want to now jump to another question. I'd like to go to what we were speaking about at the beginning. Taeksung spoke about the fact that there were fundamental points at the beginning of planning that had to be very clear and well planned out and basic. And I want to ask Chris, he was talking about aspects to do with mobility, the spatial distribution and connectivity. What do you think are the most crucial areas to establish in that initial planning period? If we think about the different regional scales, if you think about the transport system as a whole on one territory. I don't know if my question is clear. Maybe it was a bit too complicated.
Carolina, was the question for me?
Sí. Sí, rescatando un poco lo que contaba.
Yes. Thinking about, like, Taeksung, I wanted to know your opinion about the main crucial parts when it comes to the planning process. What needs to be defined at the very beginning in order to generate holistic policies when it comes to development of transport and use of territory?
I think that, you know, this response will be probably disappointing, but context matters. So Singapore is, if you think of, I didn't show the slide that represents institutional integration or at least desires for collaboration. And, you know, in the case of creating accessibility versus focusing on mobility is actually an important institutional change. I think we've seen in Latin America, especially over the past, decade, We've seen agencies move from being called transportation departments to mobility departments, you know, Secretaría de Movilidad. And I think that that's important, but I would like us to see us move towards secretaries of accessibility, meaning we're trying, well, you know, but that actually is a fundamental difference. We're not just trying to see how many kilometers of roadways we can pave every year, but how many, you know, jobs people can get to within 10 minutes or indicators like that. That's a change to institutionality. Context matters, not only because that's requiring stronger integration between, you know, land use authorities and transportation authorities, to use the case of Singapore, because they have a very strong land use authority, the Urban Redevelopment Authority, and Land Transport Authority. They work quite closely together. They're still distinct. And I would argue that they, you know, without a criticism to my Singaporean colleague, that it's still kind of a mobility focus than an accessibility focus. But they at least are they're singular governments working at the metropolitan scale. So that's a great advantage. Then we have, for example, in the Boston metropolitan area, which, you know, we have 160 cities and towns, each with their own city development authority and transportation department. So not only do they not work together very easily at the level of city and town, but then you multiply that times 160, how do you get strategic regional planning, which is fundamental if we're gonna, as I said at the end, kind of budding upward. And so I think that context matters, right? So even within Argentina, which is a country I don't know that well, so I'll use the case of Chile, which is a country I know better. So you have the Santiago metropolitan area, which is roughly 50 to 60 municipalities in a metropolitan area. It's very distinct to manage growth there for decarbonized accessibility than it would be in, say, Concepcion, which is a couple of jurisdictions at the most, or in, or even Valparaiso and Viña. Now, I think that the urban area of Buenos Aires is probably very distinct from Rosario in terms of the number of jurisdictions involved. So context matters, but what we should be moving towards, I believe, is much stronger coordination in integrating the mobility and territorial development objective functions with a much clearer objective, which is what we're trying to do is generate low carbon accessibility. I don't know if that sort of answers.
Can I just elaborate a bit? You're right. In fact, fascinating. This issue of accessibility versus mobility, I mentioned in my vision, yes, it's quite true that we are very focused, especially in the early years, on mobility, you know, moving people around, movement of people and goods. Increasingly, we are shifting a bit to, in fact, more so on accessibility. The latest Land Transport Master Plan on 2040 talks about 20 minutes town. Okay, it's still a bit of mobility, and we have the other indicators within that plan that says how many households are able to access to public transport within certain parameters. So it's a shifting. We are shifting a lot more to accessibility and looking at intensification, lifestyle hub, things like that. You're right, Chris is right. We used to be, in fact, we still have a bit of the strong mobility strain in us to plan, because I'm also an infrastructure man, I know what that means. Increasingly, we're moving towards accessibility focus. That's quite correct. I hope that gives a bit, I agree, the context is very important. Institutional setup, as we say in the last slide that I had in the bubble, that's very, very important and not easy to set up. Early years of collaboration, we went through a little bit of tension. There were a lot of competing demands, but over years, slowly we get to work and understand each other, and with a very clear objectives that will bring us together. And we have moved so far, and with the few version of master plan and concept plan, we have evolved, and right now it's easier to work. We still have our own problems too, but still, but much easier to work now than before. Okay, in my own experience, I can testify to that. I hope that helps in the answer. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a
Thank you very much for your answers. The answers were better than my expectation of the answers. I agree with a lot of what you were saying, and I think there is an issue that has to do with changing the paradigms and evolve towards other ways of approaching these complex issues that we confront. And I have a question now for Marelia with regards to how you think we may change this paradigm that has to do with foreign trade and interregional transport towards changing, instead of competition between countries, for example, with port, but they can start thinking about complementing these flows. Would that be an integration policy at Latin American level, for example, that could be promoted? Is there a chance for this type of approach?
Sí, gracias, Carolina.
Yes. Thank you, Carolina. For me, the solution is not a total solution. I think when you say anything, it is a regional policy and you can't impose it on countries. That will be a failure because things in practice don't work like that. At some point in Central America, which is a very small area, we thought that the plans we were doing would somehow turn out to be this country will specialize on this other country will concentrate the port flows of this region. And in practice, that doesn't work because you cannot deny countries their dreams. Think of Singapore. A few decades ago in Singapore, we never thought it would reach where they are now. That's what I tell countries. You cannot deny the dreams of saying we are organized internally and we will generate something that will be valued by clients and customers, and the users value it, and that will grow and expand. I would say that the approach should be from the bottom up. Not all countries are the same. There's always going to be a point of differentiation, and that's what I try to tell them when I work with countries. Countries tend to compete, specifically in the question to do with ports, when it comes to auxiliary services and maritime transport. The flows in the countries in ports are not identical. That will depend on the hinterland structure. If they have a bigger composition, for example, perishable products or non-perishable or textile products, the possibility of specializing deeper in those services of added value, which are the services that can generate jobs, because auxiliary services and port services don't generate jobs. This is something to do with complementary policies. So if you understand that, you're going to be able to draft effective policies. Honduras wanted to be a hub. We have a very interesting committee that is conformed by organizations and municipalities of the area of influence of the most important port in the country, the deep water ones, port in Panama. And finally, they understood that they weren't interested to be a hub, but they wanted to be a gateway. And there is a subtle difference between the two. And the hub was for Panama or to the Dominican Republic and those countries that are in the Caribbean triangle. But for countries such as Honduras, which is even more interesting because they are the gateway or of exit to Guatemala, Nicaragua, and parts of Mexico. So you must understand what is the nature of the flow and what that flow requires as an additional service to position themselves in a better way.
y que a su vez esos servicios de valor
at the same
agregado son los
time,
que generan
those added
oportunidades
value
de
services are the
empleo y
ones
de
that generate job
diferenciación que uno va a
opportunities and
lograr
differentiation that you will be able
sistema
to
más
achieve
armónico a
with a
nivel
more harmonious
latinoamericano,
system
más que
at
estar
Latin
con
American
las
level,
políticas
rather than
top-down
having the
diciendo, no,
top-down policies saying
este país es el que va a ser
this
el puerto más
country will be
importante,
the
va a ser
one that
secundario,
will
eso no va a
have the most
funcionar.
important
Eso no va a
port,
funcionar. Uno
etc.
tiene, por
That won't
ejemplo, los
work.
países de África del Oeste,
What happens
que
in
son países
Western
que compiten
Africa,
a muerte
they
por
compete
capturar
to
los
the
flujos
death
hacia el
to
hinterland de los
capture
países
the
enclavados,
flows towards
y
the
eso es muy sano
hinterland
porque esa
of
competencia ha
landlocked country,
permitido
and that
que
is
se
not healthy
desarrolle,
because
que
that
se
has
modernicen las
allowed
infraestructuras, que
the
se avance en la
infrastructures
reforma de los procesos de
not to
comercio
advance
exterior,
or to
que
reform the
avancen relativamente
external
rápido en todo lo que es
trade
el acuerdo de
programs
facilitación
and
del
to
comercio. Es
quickly
precisamente esa competencia
aid
que es
trade.
relativamente
The
sana. Entonces, mi
competition,
conclusión
if it's
para
healthy,
cerrar
it's
es
good,
esa. O
and
sea,
that's my
no lo veo
conclusion.
como una política
I don't see
top-down, lo
it
veo
as
más
a
como un
top-down
entendimiento bien
policy, but
concreto, cómo
rather
se
as a
posiciona
more
el
complete
país en la
understanding
región
in
y
how the country
focalizarse
is
en el
positioned in
desarrollo de
the
una
region
gama de
and to
servicios que
focus
diferencie
on
y que sea un
developing
verdadero aporte para los
services that
usuarios
can
de
differentiate
ese
them
puerto,
and
más
become
que en
attractive
una
to
competencia
users and
simple por
customers
servicios
more than a
que
simple
tienen
competition
poco
towards
diferenciación, como
services
son los
that are
servicios
not
marítimos
very
y los
well
servicios
differentiated to
auxiliares.
services that are auxiliary. Thank you, Marelia, for your views. I want to ask something with regards to, I want to ask Chris the following. The question is more towards a not so regional, more local. Can you explain in detail how to create low carbon communities and how can that produce low carbon behaviors? What are the patterns or the aspects that can achieve that?
The difficulty, so I saw this version of the question posed, and I think it was in response to a graphic that I showed that suggested the causality is not obvious. So you can build a carbon efficient neighborhood, but we don't guarantee that that will be a carbon efficient outcome because people can choose to do what they want. So, and this manifests itself, you know, in the end, when we're talking about carbon emissions in multiple ways. So let's just say, first take the example of trying to reduce travel behavior, travel emissions. So you build a carbon efficient neighborhood. What that might do is actually save people time, right? Because, oh, now if you fulfill the 15-minute city that Singapore envisions, well, what do people do with that time? They might invest in more trips to Malaysia on the weekends, or, you know, going to Changi and then flying to Indonesia for the weekend. And so this carbon, you know, the reinvestment of the time and money matters when it comes to the global atmosphere. That doesn't mean it's not really good for local living. Like, it'd still be good for local congestion and decreasing the peak and increasing local vitality, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee low carbon. And that's only bounding the mobility picture. But, you know, you also have to think of, because carbon is the atmosphere is the biggest pooled resource, right? So what if I never, you know, I can use myself as an example, especially in these current days, right? I have a very low carbon footprint from my travel because I barely ever leave my home because of COVID. And yet I can tell you I'm using a lot more air conditioning, right? I mean, I know that's a facetious example, but it is like a good example of what happened. I actually, mostly when I'm in a normal lifestyle, I travel by bicycle all around town. I have that luck. I have that convenience of living the 15-minute city. But I have a very high carbon footprint because I reinvest that time and money in, you know, more long distance travel. And so this is why I think, you know, if I were able to do one single thing to reduce our carbon footprint and then allow our territories and mobility to systems to evolve as they should, I would say, let's just tax carbon, get that market correct. And I think we'll see a lot of the other pieces fall into place. But since we don't seem to be moving in that direction aggressively enough, then I do think we need to be building carbon efficient structures, recognizing that we might not get exactly what it is we hope we get, because in the end, people are free to choose to do what they do and reinvest their time and savings in what they are able to reinvest in. Does that, I hope that was kind of clear. It's a very challenging topic.
Sí, creo que coincido un poco con la.
I agree a bit with regards to the complexity that you're talking about when expressing this example, but that makes me think about what are the trade-offs that you have with different strategies and different ways of planning or moving forward with a policy or a project for transport, for infrastructure, for commerce, for urban development. We are coming to the end of our session. There's a lot of questions that I would have liked to ask. I am fascinated by this subject, and I think this is a very important, but I'm going to invite you all in the same order that you presented to give me, in very briefly, one sentence or one phrase that you think is the key message to give towards other professionals, other decision makers in the transport sectors, which is what has brought us here in order to face these big challenges. Just one question, just one word, very small sentence, please. Can you begin, Agustina? Who? Oh, sorry, Lutik Soon. Can you begin?
Okay,
I'm sorry.
Okay, I think I used that term. Get the basics right. Okay, listen to the professionals.
Muchas gracias. Agustina.
Thank you. Agustina? The importance in planning in different scales, at different scales. Chris?
Don't forget about price mechanisms. But consistent with what was said by both Agustina and Luc Tiong as well. Sorry, Luc Texiong.
Marelia?
Que la planificación es más efectiva y mantiene más probabilidades de éxito en la medida en que uno incorpora el diálogo y la coordinación con todos los actores implicados desde los primeros momentos.
From the very beginning.
Muy importante también, sí. Y
that's crucial too. Sunku?
I think the most important thing for decarbonizing transport is coordination among many different stakeholders, but it's not easy.
No, claro, creo que todos coincidimos.
No, of course not. We all agree on that. With that, may I thank all of you for being here, for the dedication and the know-how you have brought to this panel. It's been a fantastic conversation. There's always the potential to keep working on these issues, to incorporate some of the lessons learned in Latin America, Argentina, and the rest of the world. I believe we must always rethink, question, and to use that as an input to formulate actions destined to integrate transport with territorial development and to go towards more sustainable development models which are resilient and low in emissions. I'd also like to thank the panelists and the interpreters who dedicate their time. Joshua Paternina Blanco will speak now to give some information and to thank you in the name of the
Muchas
organizers.
gracias, Carolina. Bueno, como Últimos mensajes. Primero que todo, a todo el público, no duden en contactarnos con más preguntas, comentarios y sugerencias. Sabemos que hay algunas preguntas que no fueron respondidas, entonces les invitamos a que las vuelvan a poner en el grupo LinkedIn que ponemos a continuación con los hashtags que hemos mencionado. Igualmente recuerden, por favor, que todas las presentaciones y los videos de esta conferencia estarán disponibles en el sitio web de la conferencia.
Website.
Sin más, los invitamos a todos a participar en la última sesión abierta de esta conferencia, que tendrá lugar el próximo jueves, el jueves de esta semana, 30 de julio, a las 10 de la mañana en Argentina, 3 de la tarde, hora de París. Durante esta sesión haremos una recapitulación de lo sucedido durante todo este mes, mencionando algunos de los mensajes más destacados del diálogo desarrollado a lo largo de todos los seminarios. Y también contaremos con las palabras de cierre de las autoridades y organizaciones que han hecho posible este enriquecedor evento. Una vez más, en nombre de los organizadores de este evento, y en particular del Foro Internacional de Transporte y el Instituto Wuppertal, el Grupo de Trabajo de Transporte, the International Transport Forum,
and the Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety. I thank you all for this exchange of ideas. Thanks again. Have a good day. And for our colleagues in Asia, good evening.